version of SSJI Presents, which is a presentation about invasive species in the South Shore IBA with Amanda Tracey from Nature Conservancy Canada. We're very excited to have Amanda with us this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, Megan Miller, who's our network organizer, is kind of controlling as host for this webinar. And she will also be moderating the question and answer period at the end. So after Amanda has given her presentation, she'll be taking questions. And as I said, Megan will moderate that. If you want to put a question forward, you can use the chat box in Zoom. So if you enter your questions in the chat box, they'll all be collected and dealt with them at the end of the presentation. Also at the end of the presentation, it'll be worth your while to stay on to see a brand new video that SSJI has had produced, excuse me, with the talent of Brian Noth, who is a rather famous videographer in the county. So stay right to the end for that. So many of you have probably seen this, this map before of our South Shore important bird and biodiversity area. That's outlined with the purple line and the various chunks of property that are now under some form of protection. I'd like to thank all of our partners, and we've got the logos of our partners on the screen here, for their support and involvement in helping to recognize the South Shore as an important natural area that deserves protection. This is the last piece, significant piece of undeveloped shoreline in Lake Ontario, and is host to at least 41 species at risk, in addition to being a place where locals and visitors can enjoy nature. It's great that we all come together to reach this goal. Now, since Nature Conservancy Canada is involved, I should point out that Nature Conservancy is looking after the following properties. So where my cursor is here is the Hudge and Rose Reserve. Down here is a Maple Cross Nature Reserve. Over here is the Bass Nature Reserve. And soon to come is going to be McMahon Bluff, which is just outside the IBA. And of course, pretty soon, the Ostrander Point Crownland Block and Point Peter Provincial Wildlife Area, which the province is shortly, we expect, going to designate as conservation reserves. So let's introduce a bit about Amanda. Amanda completed her PhD in biology at Queen's University in 2017 with a focus on plant community ecology and understanding how natural plant communities are structured. During her undergraduate and graduate studies, she spent 10 field seasons working at the Queen's University Biological Station, designing and implementing experiments and collecting data. Now as a conservation biologist with Nature Conservancy of Canada, Amanda coordinates stewardship work in the Napanee Plain and Eastern Lake Ontario coast natural areas, the latter of which includes the South Shore of Prince Edward County. And as I noted before, several properties in the county come under Amanda's purview. Outside of her role with the NCC, Amanda is an avid volunteer with many groups, including Kingston Junior Naturalists and Ontario Women's Anglers Junior Club. She's also a co-founder of Dispatches from the Field, a blog that shares stories about field work from biologists all over the world. This blog was shortlisted in 2017 as one of Canada's favorite science communication and education blogs. So Amanda has been working on properties in the county, and all of you may have questions about invasive species in the county. And just should note, she's done a lot of work researching plant species. Many are interesting, some are rare, but some are alien and invasive. So tonight we're going to learn all about that and hopefully have a good educational experience. So I will unshare my screen, Amanda, and you can take over.
Okay, thank you, John.
There.
Okay, can you see that, John?
That looks great.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that introduction, John, and I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about invasive species in the South Shore IBA. Invasive species is one of my favorite topics to talk about, although they aren't one of my favorite things, and I'm sure you'll be able to gauge that by the end of my talk tonight. So just a quick outline, just so you know where I want to go tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit more, expand on what John already touched on in terms of NCC's involvement in Prince Edward County. And then I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different invasive species, largely plants because plants are my thing, but I did put zebra mussels in here just because that's a really great example of something that's not a plant and invasive. And then I'm going to give a little bit of information about invasive species control and decision making, including a little bit of a case study, talk about invasive species reporting, and then what all of us can do to help with the invasive species problem. So just quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Nature Conservancy of Canada, or NCC as we call for short, the NCC leads and inspires everyone to join us in creating a legacy for future generations by conserving important natural areas and all of biological diversity across Canada as a country. And so NCC started in 1962, and since 1962, both directly and with partners, NCC has protected over 14 million hectares of land, and that includes habitat for over 231 species at risk. And of that 14 million hectares, 83,000 of those are in Ontario, and they range everywhere from the north shore of Lake Superior to Pelee Island, and then of course to the south shore of Prince Edward County as well. And just a little history of NCC in Prince Edward County specifically. In the late 1970s, NCC acquired Maine Duck Island, and I will show you a map of all of this in a second, actually the same map John showed, just so we can get our bearings. And the management of Maine Duck Island was transferred to Parks Canada, and it remains that way today. In 2012, assisted Hastings Prince Edward Land Trust with the acquisition of the Miller Family Nature Reserve. In 2018, NCC purchased the Hudge and Rose property, which is on the east side of the Ostrander Point Crownland block. And then the following year purchased the Maple Cross Coastline Reserve property, which is on the west side of the Ostrander Point Crownland block. And then in 2020 purchased the Bass Family Nature Reserve. And then really late, I think towards the end of mid to end of December 2020, the McMahon Bluff property was very generously donated to NCC by Mr. Mike Wilson. And so you can see on this map here, there's sort of two boundaries we're working with. So there's this blue boundary here, and that is the South Shore IBA, or important bird area boundary. And then there's the green line as well, which is sort of our focal area, or NCC's focal area in the South Shore. And then so many different conservation lands across the South Shore, as John had alluded to already, from Timber Island, or sorry, Maine Duck Island, which is way out here in Lake Ontario, Timber Island Provincial Park, which is regulated as a nature reserve class provincial park, the Prince Edward Point National Wildlife Area, Ducks Unlimited property, Little Bluff Conservation Area, and then the big orange block here is the Ostrander Point Crownland block, sandwiched by NCC's property. This submarine shaped property up here is that new McMahon Bluff property. And then we have the Miller Family Nature Reserve and Point Peter down here, our Mark Bass, or our Bass Family Nature Reserve property up here, and then a little bit of sandbanks visible up here as well. So the amount of protected land on the south shore of Prince Edward County seems to be growing rapidly, and that's obviously very exciting for all of us. So why are we interested in working in Prince Edward County? Well, there's just such an incredible diversity of habitats and species. So in terms of habitats, there's these beautiful, vast expanses of Lake Ontario shoreline, just stunning. Alvars, so areas of shallow limestone that support a really rare group of species. We have lots of different sort of grassland, meadowy type habitats, and even some forest habitats as well. And then because of the diversity of habitats that the IBA supports, we get a really unique suite of species as well. It's a hotspot for staging and stopover during migration of birds. So we see a huge richness of bird species in this area, especially during migration. Historically, the IBA has been well known for its populations of grassland breeding birds. So things like bobolink that you see pictured here, or eastern meadowlark. And until the 1970s, and partially into the 90s as well, Henslow sparrow as well being reported in Prince Edward County. And then, of course, breeding and staging and stopover habitat for monarch butterflies. And of course, the iconic and always smiling, I think probably the panda of Prince Edward County is the Blandings turtle. And importantly, all the species that you see listed here are actually all species at risk. And invasive species are actually a huge threat to species at risk. And the work that we do on the south shore of Prince Edward County often has to do with trying to mitigate the threat of invasive species to these species at risk that you see pictured here. And I just wanted to quickly mention how exactly we would go about doing something like that. So my job with NCC is as a conservation biologist. So I am responsible for conservation planning on our properties and also putting into place all of the stewardship work. So actually going out and organizing it and doing it. And there's two things that we do for all of our properties. One of them, the first thing, is complete a baseline inventory. So we go through and we delineate all of the ecological communities. We look for species at risk, and or also just species at risk habitat, so potential habitat for species at risk. We look for invasive species. We look for anthropogenic features, so things that are man-made and not natural in the landscape. And also really try to dive into the history of the property as well. And then once we have that baseline inventory together, we go through and create property management plans. And so what we have to do in a property management plan is we identify what our biodiversity targets are. And generally that is something like, say, we have wetland, maybe we have some alvar, maybe we have some grassland birds. So those would all be biodiversity targets. Then we have to think about what the threats to those targets are. So it could be something like inappropriate recreational use. So that would be like riding ATVs. It could be invasive species, just what we're going to talk all about tonight. It could be changing Lake Ontario water levels. There could be so many things that are threats to those biodiversity targets. And then we rank the impact of the threats on those targets. So how severe are they? And finally, we create an action plan. So we think about what can we do to either reduce, mitigate, or remove the impacts of those threats on those targets. So if ATV use is a threat on an alvar, can we put up a gate or manage recreation in some way? If invasive species is a problem, then we need to control them. So those are the types of things that would end up in that action plan, in a property management plan. Okay, so now moving into all about invasive species, which is why we're all here tonight. So right off the bat, I just want to define what an invasive species actually is. And this is according to the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So they're defined as non-native species whose introduction or spread negatively impacts native biodiversity, the economy and/or society, including human health. And non-native species refer to any plants, animals, or microorganisms that could have been accidentally or deliberately introduced into areas that are beyond what their normal range would be. You can often also hear them referred to as alien species, introduced species, or exotic species. But in this case, invasive species has a little bit of a different meaning. And it's important to note too that not all non-native species are considered invasive. So there are some non-native species that can just kind of work their way in and coexist. They don't really have a whole lot of negative impacts, but there are others that are non-native are also considered invasive because they have such a bad impact. And invasive species can be anything from plants to insects, fungi, fish, mammals. They can really be anything. And as I go through the different species tonight, I'll talk about each one of their individual impacts, but overall, just in general, invasive species have lots of negative impacts, including reducing crop yield and the value of crops, endangering livestock. They are problematic for regenerating forests. They can alter the chemistry of the soil. They can reduce habitat for wildlife and also reduce food sources for wildlife. They can reduce native plant diversity, and they can also cause problems with human health. And this is a picture here, not from the South Shore, but from the Brighton area, actually, of my wonderful interns 2 summers ago who had just hand pulled that giant pile of Himalayan balsam. I don't know if I've ever seen Himalayan balsam in Prince Edward County, but we definitely have it in Brighton. And so, I mean, it doesn't take much to convince people usually that invasive species are bad, but sometimes attaching a dollar value to it can just sort of drive that point home. And so all of the data here is from this report called The Estimated Expenditures on Invasive Species by Ontario Municipalities and Conservation Authorities. And you can access that whole report at invasivespeciescenter.ca. They actually have a really good 2-page infographic summary, and it talks about the cost of invasive species. And so it's estimated that municipalities and conservation authorities across Ontario spend $50.8 million per year on invasive species. And that doesn't actually include the other potential impacts of invasive species, so the impacts that they could have on agriculture, on the fisheries, on forests, on healthcare, tourism, recreation, and those are estimated to be approximately $3.6 billion per year in Ontario. So invasive species can have quite a substantial impact on biodiversity, but also economically as well. Okay, so we'll move on to getting into the actual invasive species we're going to talk about tonight. And the first one I wanted to touch on were zebra mussels. And it's funny because as I was preparing this talk, I put classic example of invasive species. And I don't really mean, but then I thought, you know, well, they've only been here since the 1980s. So it's not classic in terms of a timeline, but more in terms of how the invasion actually occurred. It's pretty textbook. So you can see zebra mussels here. They're freshwater bivalves. They're native to Eurasia, the sort of Black Sea area. And they arrived in ballast water from ships, and they're found in the Great Lakes. They really impact water filtration. So they sort of filter water excessively, and they decrease available food for other species. They can cause problems with increased vegetation growth. And they can also increase toxic algal blooms because they selectively feed, so it can disrupt the balance of algae in the system that they're in. And they also cause issues for recreation. So I don't know who here has walked along the South Shore of Prince Edward County on the beach, but if you were to walk in bare feet in some sections, you would probably end up with lots of little cuts all over your feet because these guys are really sharp. And when they wash up onto the shore, they can create problems for people trying to enjoy the beach, or people can cut their feet when they're swimming, etc. So they do create some issues for recreation. Eradication of zebra mussels would be really difficult at this point and extremely costly. And so it seems like right now the focus is really on prevention. So a focus on stopping the spread of them to other bodies of water and other water systems. Practicing the drain, clean, dry protocol. So if you're using some sort of watercraft, when you go from one body of water to another, you drain things like your live well out. You clean the vessel and let it dry fully before putting it into a new body of water. And of course, reporting new sightings of it, which I will talk about how you can report new sightings of invasive species more towards the end of the talk. Okay, so the next species I want to talk about was garlic mustard, but before I get into the actual plant species, I just wanted to mention that I will talk about possible control measures for each one of the species that I'm going to outline tonight. But just because I mention the different control measures doesn't mean you should do any one or any combination of those. So every species that I'm going to talk about tonight has what's called a best management practice in Ontario. And every invasive species invasion is unique. So what you would need to do is actually go and refer to the best management practice yourself. and use the decision-making tools that are provided in there to decide how you're going to manage your invasion. And I will show you the link to where you can find all of these best management practices at the end as well. Okay, so garlic mustard. I know this is, I wanted to start with this one because I know this is one that's pretty widely recognized by a lot of people. So it's native to Europe, and it was introduced as a food source / herbal medicine, and it escaped cultivation in the late 1800s, it's suspected. It's a biennial, so that means that it completes its life cycle in 2 years. So it grows as a rosette in its first year, and then it will bolt and flower and produce seeds in its second, and then it dies. And it's interesting because it overwinters as a rosette, obviously. It's a biennial, as I just said, but the leaves remain green throughout the winter. And this really gives it kind of a jump start in the spring. It's ahead of a lot of the other plants. It comes up really early. It has pretty shallow roots, and it's really strongly scented. So just like the name suggests, if you were to take one of its leaves and crush it between your fingers, it really does smell like garlic. And there's some excellent recipes floating around for using garlic mustard leaves for like a pesto. And you want to do that when the leaves are young, not after they've flowered and produced seeds, because they do get some toxin build up and they can be kind of bitter at that point. But you can see in the bottom left here, we have, that's what one of the rosettes looks like. And they're kind of kidney shaped and quite small. And then the next picture shows you what the flowers and leaves look like. So alternate leaves, very deeply, sharply toothed, and with tiny white flowers. And then they spread only by seed, but they can produce a lot of seeds. So up to 105,000 seeds per meter squared. So they are quite aggressive in terms of their seed production. And they grow in a variety of habitats, often disturbed sites, which you will sense that will be a theme of all of these species, is disturbance. You typically find garlic mustard on the South Shore, places like edges of fields, edges of woodlands, the sides of trails, even just in gardens. The species does prefer limestone, so it makes sense why it would be a problem in Prince Edward County. It can grow in full shade, but it can also grow with some sun. And it doesn't necessarily need disturbance, so you can see invasions of it in like old growth forests that have been relatively undisturbed. So it's quite versatile in where you can find it. And it has this advance and retreat growth pattern, so it kind of comes in waves. So some years you'll see a lot of biennials, you won't necessarily see many flowering plants, and then in others it'll be totally opposite. So it can be kind of tricky to manage for that reason. Okay, so a little bit about the impacts of garlic mustard specifically. So it displaces native species. It grows early, it grows quickly, it takes up space that native species would normally grow in. It's also allelopathic, and what this means is that it exudes chemicals into the soil, and those chemicals make the surrounding area pretty inhospitable for plants other than itself. So it's a pretty sneaky way to be able to keep other species out of the area. Yeah, quick growing, early growing, like I said. It's also a viral host, so it can host several viruses. I don't remember what all of them are, but I know that the cucumber mosaic virus is one of them. So but there's others that it can host as well. And for livestock, if livestock eat garlic mustard, sometimes the flavor of garlic can actually be found in their milk. And so that makes it just not a good product at that point. They can't use it anymore at that point. So it can also impact that too. And so there's lots of different ways to control garlic mustard that are outlined in the best management practice. Everything from hand pulling them, which is quite easy. You can see this photo here of one of NCC staff pulling garlic mustard. Like I said, it has shallow roots, so it does come out quite easily. You can do cutting or mowing, just clipping off the flower heads, chemical control, biological control, controlled burns. But again, you need to refer to the best management practices because it helps you consider things like the density of the infested area combined with the size of it, as well as thinking about the point in the life cycle. So are they just rosettes? Are they just starting to grow at the beginning of the spring? Do they already have seed pods on them? Because depending on what point of the life cycle you're in, that can also determine the path of control that you take. And you also want to be really cautious and careful with the surrounding plants because of garlic mustard being found in more typically shaded areas, it can often overlap with species like drooping trillium or ginseng. So you want to be really careful to take inventory of what might be growing around it as well. And in terms of disposing of garlic mustard, putting it in black plastic, so like a garbage bag essentially, and then leaving it in the sun for at least 1 week. And this kind of like solarizes the seeds and kills them so that they're not viable anymore. Okay, so moving on to dog strangling vine. So dog strangling vine is a very abundant species on the south shore of Prince Edward County, introduced in the late 1800s, either as an accidental introduction or it was introduced for ornamental reasons and then it escaped its garden setting. It's native to Eastern Europe. It is a perennial, so it completes its life cycle over several years. It has, you can see really well in this picture here, it has these really big, smooth, opposite leaves. And it's an interesting plant because its leaves are the biggest in the center of the plant. So the leaves are actually smaller at both the top and the bottom of the plant. And the leaves can vary a lot in color. So often, especially I find in more moist, shadier areas, you'll see them as a really deep, like nice dark green, but they can also appear very sort of limey or yellowy green almost. And from my experience, that seems to be, I notice it the most that it's yellow green when there's some drought happening. So in the peak of the summer, when we haven't had rain for a while, they tend to look a little bit more like that. Or sometimes if there's been control on the population the year before, they might look like that as well. They have red star-shaped flowers, which actually are very beautiful, but they're not very obvious. So they're really easy to miss. The plant can twine up around trees and other plants, hence the name dog strangling-vine, although it's never, as far as I know, been known to actually have strangled any dogs before. And its seeds are dispersed by wind. And actually, I was cleaning out a drawer today and I found these milkweed seeds in there. These are the seeds of common milkweed. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with what those look like. And actually, dog strangling-vine seeds look quite similar. They are in the milkweed family, so they have those similar pods, but milkweed pods are really, they're quite large and really fuzzy and rough, whereas these pods are quite a bit smaller and they're smooth. But the seeds are the same. They have that fluffy sort of pappus on the end and they're wind dispersed. They're just a little bit smaller. And they can again grow in a huge range of habitats. So, but preferring limestone, of course, we're so lucky here. And anything from, honestly, I've seen it everywhere. So if you name a habitat, I can almost guarantee you I've seen dog strangling-vine in it, from beaches to fields to alvars and closed canopy forests and young woodlands and shrublands and roadsides and railways and growing almost out of pavement sometimes. It just can grow anywhere. It's such an aggressive plant. Again, so the impacts of dog strangling-vine affects native plant communities. It outcompetes native species, just like garlic mustard did, especially by creating heavy shade. It can grow in really, really dense stands. And that top picture there with the gentleman in the orange, That photo was taken at the Prince Edward Point National Wildlife Area, and you can see there how if you were, that's all dog strangling vine that you see growing on the ground, and if you were another plant attempting to grow there, that would be really difficult to do. You'd be really shaded out. Dog strangling vine is also allelopathic, just like garlic mustard is. So again, it exudes those chemicals into the soil, making the surrounding area pretty inhospitable for other species to grow. It can decrease habitat for species. So think like a grassland bird or something that normally, you know, if you think of what a grassland would normally be, a mix of grasses and other wildflowers, forbs, things like that. Once this species comes in and takes over, it really decreases the available species for habitat for species, because they just can't move as easily anymore. It also has impacts on monarchs for two reasons. One, it outcompetes monarchs' native hosts, so things like, you know, butterfly milkweed or common milkweed, but also, and the results from studies vary on this, but it could potentially have impacts on the success of monarch butterflies. So as we know, monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed, and then when their larvae emerge, they feed on it. Some studies have suggested that monarchs may lay their eggs on dog strangling vine mistakenly, and once the larvae emerge, the plant's actually toxic to them, so they won't be able to complete their life cycle. But there is a little bit of a mix in research on that. I was looking it up the other day, and it definitely can go. There's some that think that that's true and some that don't. So it's still just an important consideration regardless. It also suppresses tree growth. If you have an area where you're trying to do tree planting and dog strangling vine gets in there, it could be very problematic for those little trees. They can be easily shaded out and outcompeted by this species. And it may also be toxic to livestock, again, not good, and for recreation. So if you think about that top picture again there, if that was, you know, I mean, I was trying to walk through it, it was not easy. So if, you know, this is on a trail or other, you know, natural area that people are trying to enjoy, it could be a hazard for many reasons, including as a tripping hazard while you're hiking around. And so control measures for dog strangling vine. So highly dependent on all these considerations along the right-hand side here, especially the size of the population. But some of the control measures could include digging it up, trying to get all of the roots, mowing it down. But with any species where something like mowing is recommended, you have to continuously do it. You have to commit to it, because if you just do it once in one season, it's probably actually going to make it worse. So it's repeated mowing is really what it should say there. Clipping, tarping is recommended in some best management practices. So that would be like putting plastic over something and solarizing everything underneath it. And that certainly would work to kill some of these plants. But unfortunately, you're also going to end up killing a lot of the microorganisms in the soil. So you could sometimes do more harm than good. Pulling it can sometimes work at a smaller scale if you do your best to get the whole root system every time you pull a plant. And then seed pod removal, if you have no other way to get rid of it, is at least one way of stopping it from spreading as quickly. But again, consulting best management practices to think about the size and density, etc., in terms of what might be the best action for you specifically to take. And then for disposal, again, black plastic bag, but leave in the sun for longer, so up to 3 weeks for this species. It can take, it's quite a hardy species, so it can take a little bit longer for the heat to kill its seeds. Okay, so moving on to wild parsnip. So this for me, I've spent a lot of time managing wild parsnip, but this is one of those species that, despite spending, you know, 10+ years in the field before coming to NCC, I really didn't see a whole lot of it. It seems to have really blown up in the last few years. It's native to Europe and Asia, but it's suspected that it's been here since about the early 1600s. and it was introduced as a crop. So the root of this plant actually looks like it is a parsnip, and it's edible. So it was introduced as a crop, but at some point it escaped cultivation. I always thought that wild parsnip was a biennial like garlic mustard, and it can just last 2 years, but it's technically a short-lived perennial because apparently it does last longer than 2 years sometimes. It gets to anywhere from 1/2 meter to 1.5 meters tall, so it can get to be quite a substantial plant. It has a hollow stem that is incredibly strong. It's hopefully you've never come in contact with this plant, and I'll tell you why in a second, but if you tried to break its stem, it's very, very difficult to do so, despite it being hollow. So it's not a solid stem, but you can see in that picture on the top right there that it has these really deep grooves in it, and that's one of the key sort of identifying features to this species. And its leaves. So once you see wild parsnip leaves, you cannot unsee them. You will always see them. You will see them everywhere. It's a bit of a curse, I think. So it has these really distinct big leaves at the base that are have these saw-toothed edges. You can see here, and hopefully you can see here in this picture. And yeah, they're so easily recognizable. And they have these flat-topped flower clusters. Again, very recognizable. You've probably seen, if you've traveled on the 401 anywhere between, like Belleville and Kingston in the summer, you would have seen this everywhere. And it typically grows, it flowers from June to September, and then it produces seeds that disperse late in the summer, and they can last several years in the seed bank, I think 5 or more. And they grow anywhere. They prefer sunnier habitats, but they will grow with some shade. And they often grow, again, like the other species, in disturbed areas. Especially this species is very connected to disturbance. So on the south shore of Prince Edward County, for instance, we have this species on our Maple Cross Coastline Reserve property, but the only place we have it is along the trail that people walk on. And before we had that property, people would drive down that trail, and I think that's how it got there, was via tires on vehicles. But yeah, so it really does overlap with disturbance. You'll see it a lot, like at dump sites. So where if you come across like some old dumped garbage on old farmland or something, you'll often see it kind of in that area. You see them at waste disposal sites, ditches, railways, and then recently abandoned areas too. So things like recently abandoned sand quarries, for instance, you'll see that growing a lot there. And like I said, it's really taken off, especially in the past 20 years in Eastern Ontario specifically. So just like the other species that we've talked about so far, wild parsnip outcompetes native vegetation, including lots of important pollinator plants that you would normally find in the areas that it grows in. Because of its life cycle, so in its first year, it's a rosette, similar to garlic mustard. It has those resources come the second year for it to bolt up really quickly. And once it bolts, so once the stem actually starts growing on the plant and the flowers are developed, it's a lot harder to deal with it. It reduces forage quality, but it also has really serious health implications for humans. So the sap from this plant, so if you touch pretty much any part of it, and then you expose whatever, so say you touched it with your hand and then your hand is in the sun, it will cause severe burns and blisters on your skin because it reacts to the sun. So it actually is quite dangerous to have around as well for our own health. And again, control, mowing can work, but again, it has to be repeated. So I've seen, and maybe you've seen as well, when they've attempted to mow areas along the center of the 401 that has bad wild parsnip, And you'll see them come, they were, you know, a meter tall and they mow them all down. And then a month later, there's these teeny tiny flowers on like 10-centimeter stalks. So they've already tried to reflower. So continuously mowing is necessary. Tilling, again, tarping, pulling, but obviously carefully because of the impacts I just talked to you about, and fire and chemical treatment as well. It's really the same considerations here in terms of density and size of the infested area, but also considering the purpose of the control. Why are you doing it? Is it for biodiversity related reasons, or is it for health related reasons? Thinking about the timing of it, in particular with chemical treatment, which is often what's used for this species. Once it bolts, so once the stem has gone up, it is incredibly difficult to kill it, even with herbicides. And of course, safety is a huge consideration with this one too. So when disposing of it, don't burn it, don't compost it. You can leave it in place or bagging it, again, in black plastic for at least a week in the sun would take care of it too. And this is a newer species to me, and actually its best management practices just came out this year, so that's why I wanted to share it today. I've only seen it in a few isolated instances in on the South Shore of Prince Edward County. And this is flowering rush, and it's really misleading when you see it because it is such a beautiful plant. It's so stunning, but it's not a good plant. So it arrived, they suspect, by 1900. Again, sort of the same routes as a lot of these other invasive species, either by packing material or ballast water, or it was bought for horticultural reasons and it escaped from a garden. It's a perennial plant, and this is our first like aquatic plant. So the three that we've talked about so far have all been pretty much restricted to terrestrial areas, but this is one that grows in water. So it can grow in either emergent, so in a little bit of water, or places that are seasonally wet, or that has fluctuating water levels, or it can be totally submerged. So the vast majority of the plant can be underwater. And it has one of the really big key identification features is in that top picture right there. It has these really triangular leaves, not so much at the top of the leaf, but if you were to pull a leaf off from the base, towards the bottom, they're very obviously triangular, like in that photo. And its leaves can sort of behave a little bit differently depending on the habitat that the plant is growing in. So when it's in emergent conditions, so not too much water, just a little bit, it has really rigid leaves that are like they stand quite erect. But when it's in a submergent habitat, it has what I can only describe really as like elastic leaves. So they have a lot more flow and movement to them. And it flowers between June and September with these beautiful umbrella-shaped umbels that have these kind of white to pinkish flowers. And it has 2 reproductive types, and that determines how it can spread. And I don't really know how to tell these reproductive types apart. I don't know which one we would have in this area. All I know is that 2 exist in North America. And so one would be a diploid, which has 2 sets of chromosomes, which allows it to reproduce via seed, but also by rhizomes in its roots, and by bulbils. But there's also a triploid, which has 3 sets of chromosomes, which basically means that it can't produce seeds. So it's sexually sterile, but it still produces the other ways. And so I've seen, like I said, in a small number of places in Prince Edward County, I've seen this, but I have seen it other places, like in Brighton and Wolf Island, for instance, as well. And it's never really been at the top of my priority list. There's always some other invasive species that I think has higher priority than flowering rush. But when the best management practices came out, I thought, well, there must be a reason they made a best management practice for this. And if you go and take a look at that document, you will see that there are some pretty crazy examples of how rapidly the species can grow and take over. So again, it impacts native vegetation and reduces biodiversity. Those are things that, you know, all of these species do, it can form really dense mats and fill in areas, which as a result can do things like alter habitat for other animals like fish, or like our water birds, marsh nesting birds. When it does form those dense mats, it can change water temperature significantly, which can have lead to a whole other mix of changes and problems. And it can also clog drainage ditches, so it can alter the way that water moves and cause flooding, etc. So you're a bit more limited with how you can control flowering rush. Again, taking into account all of those different considerations. One of the ways to do it is this cut and drown technique. So when it's in quite a bit of water, you can cut it below the water level, which essentially kind of suffocates it. It ends up dying. You can cut seed heads off just to prevent it from, at least slow down its spread. And you can also try to dig up its total root system. And to dispose of it, it's a little bit easier than the other ones because it's limited to growing where there's water. You can bring it above the high water mark and just leave it on dry land. And so the last species that I wanted to talk about tonight, and this is one I think that everybody is familiar with, and it's one that people always have the most questions about. So I wanted to leave it to the end and try to talk about it in a little bit more detail. But this is a common reed, or Phragmites. And in 2005, so, you know, whatever that is, 16 years ago, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada actually named it Canada's worst invasive plant. And I don't even think it was close to how bad it is now back then. So that really is saying something. So Phragmites is native to Eurasia. It was introduced in the 1800s via some packing material and shipping. And now it's widespread, especially in southern Ontario. It grows up to 5 meters tall, so it's a huge plant. It has a hollow stem, and it has multiple methods of spread, which is part of the reason why it's such a problem. So it can spread via underground rhizomes, so via its roots pretty much, above ground stolons, so sort of creeping horizontal plant stems. And it can also reproduce via seed. So it's a triple threat for sure. It's quite identifiable. It has leaves that are flat, alternate, and they're at 45-degree angles, coming off the stem like this. And they have really dense, fluffy seed heads later in the season. Again, you see it quite abundantly in the 401 corridor. But what's really amazing about this plant is its biomass. So you see this picture here, and you saw the picture on the previous slide, just how big this plant can get. But the really crazy part about it is that 80% of the plant's biomass is below ground in its roots. So if you can imagine how big it is above ground, so 80% of the entire biomass of the plant is actually not seen, and it's under the soil. So these are huge, huge plants. It's important to note that we do have a native there. So the invasive Phragmites that we're talking about now is different from the native Phragmites. So there is a Phragmites that is native to here. And we do have both of them in Prince Edward County. And so I wanted to talk about some of the differences between the two. So native Phragmites has leaf sheaths that drop easily. So if you can imagine if you have a plant stem and you have a leaf attached to it, right where the leaf attaches to the stem, if you try to pull the leaf down a little bit, there's this tissue that's wrapped around the stem of the plant, and that's called the leaf sheath. So if it drops off really easily when you pull the leaf, then that's an indicator that it could be native. But if it really adheres tightly, then it leans more towards invasive Phragmites. Native Phragmites tends to be mixed into plant communities, so it's kind of just sparsely spread throughout, whereas invasive Phragmites tends to grow as a monoculture. That being said, I have seen it the other way around in both cases. I've seen big, huge stands of native Phragmites and invasive Phragmites, I've seen it just interspersed. So that's not necessarily the best way to tell the two apart. Native Phragmites has a really smooth and shiny stem, whereas the invasive one, it's a really rough, dull stem. And when you have the two side by side, I wish I had everybody here to actually get you to physically touch the plants, but it's very obvious the difference. And native Phragmites has a really reddish purple stem, especially in the lower part of it, whereas invasive has a dull, sort of duller green and brown stem. The color of native Phragmites is more of a greeny yellow color, whereas invasive is sort of a blue-green. If you don't have the two side by side, though, that can be really difficult to use as a marker. Ligules and glooms. So ligules are if you pull the blade of the grass down, sort of right above where that leaf sheath was I was telling you about, right at the end of the blade of the grass is sort of a transparent piece of tissue, the ligule, and it can be longer on native Phragmites than invasive. But that being said, again, when we were doing measurements on this in the field, without like a magnifying glass and a ruler, it's a really hard way. It's not the easiest way to tell the two apart. Native Phragmites has sparse flower and seed heads, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, whereas it's a lot denser. You get that really fluffy look in the invasive one. And the native one has a flexible stem, whereas the invasive one is quite rigid. So if you try to bend it, it often snaps. And then again, talking about the how native should be less aggressive in terms of its spread than invasive. And really, the true way to tell the two apart is via genetic testing, but that is expensive and not widely available just to the average person. So using these as sort of your indicators is the best way to go. And sometimes they won't all line up, unfortunately. I know there are people that were doing tests to see if there were hybrids. And I know, at least in terms of all the Phragmites that we sampled from NCC properties, there weren't any hybrids that we had detected. It was always either native or invasive. And so just to show you here the differences in the flower heads. So the invasive on the left is quite robust, and the native one is kind of sparse. And then looking at the color of the stem too, you can see the invasive one is that greeny brown color, and then you've got that red on the native one. And so there's so many impacts of Phragmites. Of course, in terms of habitat and biodiversity loss, it really takes over, marshy areas. It can displace marsh nesting birds. It can alter fish and turtle habitat. It can have huge impacts on hydrology, clogging up drainage ditches, changing how water moves and water drains. It can cause physical and structural damage to things like docks. In the winter, or even in the late fall, even the summer really, it can be a huge fire hazard. In the winter, it often stays standing as its dead sort of biomass stays standing, and that can be a really big fire hazard. It can impair sight lines, so especially because it grows a lot in ditches, it can interfere with your ability to see. It's often found in construction sites and can result in them having to do a lot more work to get rid of it. Loss of productivity in agricultural areas when this starts to move in, and it can block access to important areas, for instance, like fire hydrants or something like that. And so control of Phragmites is quite complicated. It really depends mostly on where it's growing. So is it growing in standing water, which it can, or is it growing on dry land, which it also can? It can kind of grow everywhere. So on dry land, selective cutting and spading can work. Chemical control can work. In water, selective cutting and spading can work. So again, similar to flowering rush with that cut and drown technique where you cut it below the water level. Mulching, prescribed burning can work. But also So the best management practices for Phragmites were recently updated in 2020, and it's a huge 70+ page document now, but I really encourage you to look at it because it's really interesting. And they have this new control method in there called revegetation. And actually, you're kind of trying to out-compete it with something else. So they're using like aggressive seed mixes of other grasses and things like that, just trying to revegetate the area and keep it out. And there's lots of considerations to take when deciding how to manage Phragmites, and that best management practice really works through it well, depending on individual scenarios. So the density and size, of course, and how disturbed it is, but also considering the reinvasion risk, if there's a seed bank present, how it's been spread and what vectors for spread still exist there, and also how wet the area is. And in terms of disposing of it, you can bag it, you can burn it, but for Phragmites and also for all species that you do bag, you should check local guidelines with your municipality or your township or wherever you take your trash to, just to see if they have a recommended or specific way that you get rid of it. Okay, just a reminder, so the best management practices are found on the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website, which is ontarioinvasiveplants.ca, under the resources tab menu here, and then best management practices. And then they published a lot of best management practices just in 2020. So there's the new updated Phragmites one. There was an older one, but they also now have Eurasian water milfoil, frogbit, flowering rush, and white mulberry. And then a whole other, all the rest of them are in the series are listed down here. So I encourage you to check those out. And also, just to outline what this whole decision making that I keep talking about in the best management practice looks like. So what it does is it helps you set priorities. So it could have to do with keeping areas free of invasive species. That might be a priority. Focusing on satellite populations, or maybe areas that have really sensitive species or species at risk, sensitive habitats, or it might want you to focus on dispersal pathways. And so when you have something like, let's say we have garlic mustard and we have a few populations of it, we don't know where to start. That's really where this decision-making tree, which you see here from the best management practice, comes in handy. So you can say, is it present? Well, yes, it's present. And is the population small or new? Yes. And then it tells you what to do if it is. And if it's not, it asks you more questions. And so it really does allow you to tailor the control to your individual invasion. And so just as an example of how that might work, let's just pretend that there's a 2-acre lot behind a home, a wood lot behind a home in Prince Edward County. And the property owner notices what she thinks are 10 small garlic mustard rosettes along a walking path that she shares with the neighbor. What should they do? Well, we're going to refer to the best management practice for garlic mustard and 1, confirm the identification. So in the best management practice, it talks about the identification of the species, and it tells you specifically what to look for, but it's also really handy because it has a lookalikes section. So one of the lookalikes for garlic mustard is something like ground ivy or creeping Charlie, which you often see growing in lawns. It has that same kidney-shaped rosette, so it can be confusing, but it talks you through how to tell the two apart. So just confirm that it is garlic mustard that she saw in her woodlot. Use that prioritization flowchart that I just showed you if needed. So if there's multiple populations and sites, she doesn't need that because she just has 10 rosettes in one spot. And then use the control measures table to select the appropriate control method. So this is just part of the control measures table from the garlic mustard best management practice. So what you do is you consider on this side here, the density of the infested area. Is it low, 1 to 50? Is it medium, 50 to 1,000? Or is it more than 1,000 plants? And the size of the area. So does it cover, 0.1 to 0.5 hectares? Or are they just isolated plants? And in the case of this theoretical invasion here, she has 10 sort of isolated plants. So it suggests here Chemical, well, chemical herbicide can only be applied by somebody who's licensed to do so, and that's another really important point that I should make here too. So it needs to be applied by a licensed exterminator. So that's not, we're just going to say that's not an option for her. Mowing would also not be an option. The woodland it's kind of tight quarters, there's lots of trees, and there's lots of other sensitive stuff on the ground, so mowing wouldn't work. So let's say we select hand pulling. So she can go on into the best management practice to actually read about that control method. It walks you through how to do it, including disposal. Then she will perform that control method and dispose of it properly, continue controlling and monitoring for at least 5 years. And it tells you in the best management practice for how long to do that. And for garlic mustard, it suggests for at least 5, just to ensure that the whole seed bank is depleted. And then also consider whether restoration is needed. So what this means is, in this case, she wouldn't need restoration. It's just 10 plants. But if the scenario was she has a 2-acre woodlot that, you know, it's all sugar maples, but the ground is totally garlic mustard, that could be problematic. So if you pull out all that garlic mustard, leaving bare soil, one, that leaves a whole lot of empty space for garlic mustard to continue to recruit in. But 2, it also opens the door for more invasive species to move in because the empty ground is just sitting there. So considering whether restoration is needed is important, and the best management practice walks you through that as well. Okay, and then invasive species reporting. So this is something that is really easy for everybody to do. So invasive species reporting is done via the EDMAPS Ontario system. So this is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And you can report them using this website. You can see here, there's a smartphone app that you can actually use when you're out and about. And what you just do is you report instances of invasive species in your area. And what this does is it you know, often the first step for understanding how to really get a hold of these species at a landscape level is to understand exactly where they are and what their impact is. And so, you know, knowing exactly where they are is really important, and we often don't know that because so much land is private, right? So submitting to EDMAPS is key, and you can also submit via the phone. There's a 1-800 number that I will include at the end here as well. And what you can do on this EDMAPS website, and it's very cool, is you can actually click on distribution maps and you can search for certain invasive species in your area. And so unfortunately, not many people use EDMAPS in the South Shore of Prince Edward County, but I did pull up this map here for Dog Strangling-vine reports. And so there's one point up here near sort of County Road 13, and I think it's Mitchell Side Road. And there's one point down here in Point Peter, and then a whole bunch over here in Sandbanks. And you can see often what happens is these reports are sort of skewed to areas where a lot of people go. So you often see loads of reports in provincial and national parks and things like that, and then you don't see as much elsewhere. But it's still really critical just to understand the distribution, that if you see these species that you actually report them. And if you're not totally sure, that's okay, you can still report it. And you see here, over in the legend here, this is actually, I think this is not for Prince Edward County what these numbers are, but it does say positive, negative, and treated. So sometimes people will submit things that, you know, maybe you thought it was garlic mustard, but it actually was ground ivy. And somebody does review all of these submissions, so sometimes they do come up negative. So don't be scared to just try it out, even if you're not confident, because somebody is there to make sure that the reports indeed are the species that they say they are. And finally, what can we all do for invasive species? So the first thing is to learn more, which I think everybody is doing because they're here tonight. And like I said, I encourage you to check out all of these resources online on the Invasive Plant Council's website. Check out EDMAPS, just keep learning more about invasive species in your area and get to know, it says here invasive species, but really get to know your species. So go out into your backyard and just see what you have. Go to the local, you know, conservation area, check out an NCC property and see what's there. Using the iNaturalist app to learn species ID is a great tool. You can just snap a picture and it will tell you exactly what the species is. If not, it will give you sort of a short list or its best guess. So just learning how to identify species in general and invasive species it has a huge impact. Addressing pathways of introduction. So is something that you're doing actually a vector for dispersing invasive species? So are you taking your boat to multiple bodies of water each day without cleaning it in between? Are you driving an ATV to multiple places in one day, without wiping down the tires or washing them off? Just think about how your behavior could potentially be contributing to one of these pathways for introduction. And then practicing prevention. So like the drain, clean, and dry protocol for boats, even something as simple as just getting a brush to brush the bottom of your shoes off, a boot brush. When you go from, say, one area to another, maybe you go from, a provincial park to a different property somewhere, or even just home. Doing something like that can help stop the spread of invasive species too. Reporting invasive species, so through EDMAPs, which the number is right there. If you don't have access to like a computer or an app, you can report them over the phone. Develop a plan for your property using the best management practices. So if you do have invasive species, take some time to read through that and figure out exactly what the best approach for your situation would be. And finally, for those that are really interested in invasive species removal, we're just starting to pilot this year, and I don't have a whole lot of details yet because it's still very new, but this idea of a South Shore stewardship team. And so you saw that map that I shared and that John shared at the beginning, and the amount of protected land is rapidly increasing in Prince Edward County on the South Shore. And, protecting land is obviously so important, but so is stewarding land. So, taking care of things like invasive species. And we're trying to start up a volunteer team called the South Shore Stewardship Team, where people can come and actually help do some of that hands-on on the ground work. It'd be an excellent opportunity for, students who need volunteer hours, people who are just looking to get more involved in the community, get to know the area more, and even just learn more about biodiversity, because whenever we have these types of events and have people out, there's always lots of opportunities to learn as well. And so and of course, this year it might be a little bit more complicated with various restrictions and such. So the group may or may not end up actually starting, depending on what we are physically allowed to do safely. But if you're interested in joining that, I encourage you to contact me directly, and I'd be happy to chat more about that with you. And I think that is everything. I have my email here in case you have any questions about the stewardship team or about any, even anything on your property you have questions about. Do you live in Prince Edward County? Want some advice? Feel free to reach out. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was fantastic. And I'll lead to that reminder too. If anyone has any questions, put them in the chat box on your Zoom screen, and Megan will moderate them. I think for me, one of the problems with these invasive species is many of them are very attractive looking plants. Garlic mustard is really pretty in the ditch around the end of May.
Yeah.
But it's going to spread from that ditch, all over the place. And the other thing is you really have to keep your eyes open. You have to monitor, I guess, the conditions of a property. My last property, we had garlic mustard every spring in the ditch, and I worked at it every year to keep it from getting any farther. Moved here to the county in 2014, and I looked at our property and said, wow, that's great. There doesn't seem to be any garlic mustard. Then we bought two big spruce trees at Conlon Nursery and planted them in the fall of 2014. And what appeared next year was under the spruce trees in that soil ball, rosettes of garlic mustard.
Yeah.
And every year they come up, and it's easy. I've only got 2 locations and I can pull them and I know that they're not spreading, but you do have to keep your eyes open. So
Absolutely. And sorry,
yeah,
John, I just wanted to add to that on the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website, there is also a lot of information about this program they have called Grow Me Instead. So like you were saying, a lot of these invasive species are beautiful, but they do have recommendations for other similar species that you can plant as well that sort of have that similar attractive value. So that's really helpful.
for sure. So I see there are some questions now. So I'm going to let Megan Miller take over, and she can moderate the question and answer session with you.
All right, so they're starting to roll in, and just get the chat box open. All right, so a number of people have said thank you, Amanda. It's very informative. The first question will be, how can you get plants or seeds to restore an area where an invasive plant has been removed?
That's a really great question. I should have included that. But so at this time of year, you see a lot of the conservation authorities doing sort of seedling sale. I don't know if you call it a sale, but they sort of buy these mass amounts of seedlings. I know, for instance, Friends of the Salmon River is doing it right now. And you can get them for either, depending on the organization, just a donation or for a really inexpensive price. Usually you have to commit to a bigger quantity, so that kind of depends on the size of your property. But that being said, there is a place called Wildflower Farm, which has excellent, really excellent selection and really excellent quality of native seed species available. And that's actually one of the main suppliers that we use for some of our larger scale restoration projects, like buying hundreds of kilograms of seed, but they also sell much smaller amounts than that. And we have always had such great success with them. St. William's also sells seeds. That's more from southwestern Ontario though. And also Ontario Native Plants. They just opened their pre-ordering for spring. So you can get, oh my goodness, I spent so much money there already. You can get so many awesome species, like just everything from that you would need from like for a woodland or for, and they're started plants, so they get shipped to you already like grown. Trees, shrubs, they have so many different things. So I definitely recommend checking out any of those.
All right, I've got another question regarding a larger property. Thomas asks, we have a larger property, a farm with many acres. Are there larger scale supports available for management, perhaps through AMAFRA or other orgs?
That's a good question, Thomas, and I bet there probably is. One of the things that we're sort of doing a pilot of in Prince Edward County is a private land stewardship project for people with larger properties. And so it's still like in very early stages, but Thomas, if you want to write down my email address, I'd love to connect with you about that and chat more. And potentially there might actually already be some support through some of those larger organizations. So yeah, if you want to reach out, I'd be happy to chat about that.
Oh, more questions. Okay. Gord asks, is buckthorn an invasive species?
Yeah, Gord, it is. It's a very bad invasive species, and it's actually very bad in Prince Edward County, on the South Shore in particular. We have there's these whole areas where buckthorn is the most dominant species. It's funny because we go through our properties and we try to identify every single community or habitat that exists, and without fail that species is in every single one of them. So it doesn't matter if it's a closed canopy forest or if it's right along a beach. Buckthorn is everywhere. Its berries are dispersed by birds, which is why it's just moved from fence rows, which is where it sort of typically was historically, to all over the place. And it is really difficult to get rid of.
There's one more question. Liz is asking that, sorry, everyone keeps saying thank you for the presentation. And it's moving all the comments up. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to deal with dog strangling vine. Can I plant something that will outcompete dog strangling vine?
So what we've done in areas, we just did this actually at our Maple Cross property where we had a really bad invasion of dog strangling vine. We tried to plant it with Canada Wild Rye. And so Canada Wild Rye is native, but the thing about it is that it grows really, really quickly and aggressively. So if you had a chance to outcompete it with something, I would try that. And that's one of the species that is available pretty widely through like that Wildflower Farms or through St. William's, like I was mentioning before.
John F. actually just made a comment about European buckthorn. It pushes out practically all native shrubbery in a forested area as well.
I definitely agree, John. I think in some places on the South Shore, it's pushing out lilacs, which is pretty impressive because they take over really easily and are pretty aggressive. So it's just it is wild.
If anyone else has any questions, I'm not seeing any others, but I'll give it another minute just in case anyone has any last minute questions.
Megan, there's a couple in the Q&A box actually.
Oh, okay. Looking in the wrong spot. Okay. Have there been instances of giant hogweed in Prince Edward County or the South Shore?
So that's a great question. I thought the answer was no, because I've never seen it down there, but I went to EdMaps just today and looked it up, and there was one instance of it kind of near Black River actually, and it was definitely, somebody posted a picture of it, and it was definitely giant hogweed. It said there was 4 individuals, so it does exist on the South Shore. It's not widespread though, because I certainly haven't seen it anywhere else. But something to keep our eye out for.
Okay. And we have an anonymous question. Is knapweed an invasive species? And if so, how does one get rid of it?
Yeah, there are a couple of species of knapweed that are invasive. I'm trying to remember if there's a best management practice for that. I don't know. We have dealt with knapweed on some of our properties. I know that we've used like chemical means to get rid of it, but we have hand pulled it as well, and it really depends on the soil. So where we've hand pulled it from, it was really sandy soil, so it was a lot easier to pull. But again, it depends on the size of area that you have infested with knapweed, because if it's dozens of acres, then that's a lot of hand pulling, and it's not going to be really sustainable to do that. So yeah, I would take a look at for the best management practices on that. And if you can't find any more information about that, let me know, because we might have a best management practice in our records that's not necessarily from Ontario, but it's from somewhere else, which does happen for some species that Ontario doesn't have them for yet. And I'd be happy to share that with you.
John F. mentioned you could also try Canada and tall goldenrod to get rid of DSB, because it has, and I'm probably going to butcher this word, and I apologize, allelopathic properties.
Yeah, that's an excellent point again, John. So you're right. I think those would be great species to try, especially if you could get already established plants and put them in there versus seed. That might be, the goldenrods might be a good bet for outcompeting things.
Elizabeth asks, could you repeat the name of the plant to compete with the dog strangling vine?
So what I had suggested was Canada Wild Rye.
Agnes asks, what does giant hogweed look like?
So it looks similar to wild parsnip. It's in the same family, I believe. It has the really big leaves, a really, really thick stem, but it's really substantial in size, like pushing, over 1.5 meters tall. So it gets taller than what wild parsnip would, but it still has those same carrot family flowers with sort of the umbels that have the flat or sometimes rounded tops, but it has white flowers in that case.
And someone else who's anonymous is asking, how do you eliminate buckthorn?
So if they're really little, so if they're less than 1 meter tall, you can hand pull them sometimes. There's also a tool you can purchase. I think it is like a couple $100s though, but it's called an extractigator, and that can pull out trees that are or shrubs that are, you know, 1 to 2 meters tall even. It just helps you get some leverage, and it actually rips it out at the roots. If you have bigger buckthorns, really the only way to do it is to either cut it down or girdle it and apply some kind of herbicide to it, because the problem with it is that it is a sprouting species. So as soon as you cut it down, it's going to start sprouting from the base like crazy.
Apparently we should have invited John F. to be one of our panelists, because he's also saying that giant hogweed grows up to 5 meters tall, and the flower head is up to 1 meter across, and you can get severe blistering from the sap, which reacts with sunlight.
John is a wealth of knowledge for sure. I missed getting to go out in the field with John this summer, so I'm hoping things will allow for it this summer, because I always learn something when I'm with John.
John needs to be hosting a webinar, I think, with us pretty soon, given his wealth of knowledge. Thomas asks, is there a good general resource, a book or a site that you would recommend?
Well, first of all, that Ontario Invasive Plant Council site is great, but I don't know if I can go back in my slide here. Oh, right, I don't even think I mentioned it, but yes, Thomas, right here, this Landowner's Guide to Managing and Controlling Invasive Plants in Ontario is an excellent resource. You can find it, the PDF for it online.
Going back to the giant hogweed that you mentioned was in a section of Sedgwick County. Someone was asking, was the giant hogweed removed, and who does this, if so?
Yeah, I don't know if it was removed. The observation though, I'm pretty sure on EdMaps was from 2014, so it's a while ago. So I'd be surprised if somebody hadn't dealt with it by now. And what was the other part of the question?
Oh, who would do this? Like if we found another giant hogweed.
Right. So you'd need to contact something. If you contacted somewhere like a landscaping company, or somebody that does contract work like that, that'd be a good start. They often have people that are licensed to apply herbicides, which in that case you probably would want to do. Again, there's the best management practice for giant hogweed, which I'm not familiar with because I've never had to really deal with it in any of the areas that I've worked in, but you have to be very careful with that species because, like John had just pointed out, it does cause severe burns on your skin too. So you'll definitely want somebody that's, knows how to safely deal with that species.
And Anna has a question. What do you do if your neighbors have a ton of invasive plants? Are there any bylaws or anything?
That's a great question. I wish there was something you could do. I don't really know how to answer that question. You can, maybe try to politely educate them, maybe get them a copy of the Managing and Controlling Invasive Plants in Ontario. I believe it's I don't know if it's the municipality's responsibility to enforce the Weed Control Act, but I don't know if that applies to private property. I think it more has to do with like roadsides and stuff. So I don't know if there's any sort of action you could take, but I think that education is always the best route that you could, or at least the first try, just so that because they might not even know. And this is it's always going to be a problem for me in particular, managing these nature reserves. I do my best to eradicate dog strangling-vine and keep it at bay, and there's always going to be a neighbor on the other side of our property that has those invasive species too, and they're just going to keep recruiting on our land. So that's what part of the South Shore Stewardship team's job is going to be is just more working at a landscape scale to get people really dialed into these issues with invasive species and get more education out there and more awareness, because people just might not know.
And perhaps I'll just throw something in here as a counselor, that in the built-up areas, not out in the rural areas, but in the built-up areas, we do have property standards bylaws that apply, and you can't just let a lot go completely to noxious weeds, especially things like the wild parsnip, which are indeed, a human health hazard. So you can call county bylaw in that case. But that really only applies in the built-up areas. In the rural areas, as you said, Amanda, it's a question of trying to gently persuade the landowner that they should do something about it.
And speaking of dog strangling-vine, Edwin asks, what is the best point in the season to tackle dog strangling-vine?
So the earlier, the better. Once it flowers and goes to, especially once it goes to seed, there's really not a whole lot you can do, and you have to be very careful not to actually disperse the seeds further. So the earlier, the better when it's small. The problem is then, though, that it can be more difficult to identify when it's really small. But yeah, earlier is better.
I think that's all questions. I'm just double checking just in case I missed one. Oh, Kathy just made a comment. Our Westlake Community Association is wanting to do a stewardship plan for our lake. We're trying to deal with what we think is Phragmites, and they would still like you to do a talk that they had planned just before the pandemic had hit.
Oh yes, that's Kathy Coultis, right? Yes, hi Kathy.
Yep.
No, I still want to do the talk, and I will. We'll figure it out somehow.
All right, I think that is all the questions. I will give it 30 more seconds just in case anyone has any other questions, any last minute ones. Edwin actually just mentioned, not a question, but that we should do a survey monkey for invasive species for those owning property within the NCC's definition of the South Shore, and then develop a strategy for private and public property within the South Shore.
That is a fantastic idea. Yeah,
Good.
that's,
Good
I mean,
idea.
yeah, it is. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Okay. Not seeing any more questions, just a lot of thanks for the presentation and all your wealth of knowledge.
So Amanda, if you would unshare the screen, then I'll
Sure. Yeah.
take it over. Thank you so much. Perfect. So that was very useful, terrific, and you didn't even talk about bindweed, which particularly bothers my garden. I guess
You
it's
can
not
never talk about them all.
Bindweed is just a native hazard that we all end up having to live with. More on some properties than on others. So interested in learning any more, just as a reminder for everyone here this evening, just before we get to that video that I mentioned, you can visit SSJI, South Shore Joint Initiative.ca, to learn more and subscribe to the South Shoreliner, which we put out every couple of months. Follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page and do Instagram postings all the time. You can become a member and help us with the positive momentum. Don't forget, we are working towards creation of the conservation reserves, and stay tuned for more on that in the coming months. We have these webinars, virtually a monthly event now, and South Shore Strolls that will be restarting very soon. And you can donate or volunteer. I should mention something about donation right now, because today is March the 22nd. And I'm happy to announce to many of you on this call tonight that we have achieved the charity status with CRA. So we'll be able to start issuing tax receipts for donations. So, but that only takes effect on April the 1st. So if you're inclined to go to our website and make a donation right away, please just wait till April the 1st and then you can get your tax receipt rather than doing it tonight. I'll also note that we're in particular now in terms of volunteers, looking for people interested in volunteering for a fundraising committee. We're undertaking a major fundraising campaign this year. And you can email Megan, or you can find her email on the website. And I want to especially note that our next webinar on April 26th, we're hosting another webinar with the Quinty field naturalist and special guest Kyle Blaney, entitled Beauty Close to Home. Kyle will use his nature images and the stories that led to their capture to share what he's learned during the pandemic. He'll also describe how he's used iNaturalist to learn about dragonflies and moths. What else should I note? As Megan mentioned at the outset, we recorded this webinar this evening, so it will, within a couple of days, be up on our YouTube channel so that you can watch it there. Don't forget that website, OntarioInvasivePlants.ca. I'm going to go there myself and bookmark that. Really, really terrific in that. And this was, I think, very useful for all of us and very useful for the South Shore. I think we should take on Edwin's idea of somehow getting a public survey going as to where invasive plants are found, and then we'll get, say for Phragmites, we'll get Amy Bodman, who I know is on the call tonight, to organize the Phragmites removal team, right? So lots of work to do. It's unfortunate that these things have to be done, but it's just reality that we have invasive species, that at least some of them we can do something about. So